August 16, 1969, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a stage at Max Yasgur's dairy farm in Bethel, New York. 500,000 people sprawl across the muddy hillside, many of them having no idea what they're about to witness. The band taking the stage hasn't even released an album yet. Most of the crowd has never heard their name. Some members of the band are tripping on mescaline, thinking they had hours before their set. But when the first conga beat drops, when Carlos Santana's guitar begins to sing in a language no one had quite heard before, a fusion of blues, rock, and Latin rhythms that sounds like nothing else at Woodstock, everything changes. 11 minutes later, after a performance of Soul Sacrifice that will be remembered as one of the festival's defining moments, Santana walks off stage as Legends. 2 weeks after that, their debut album hits record stores. Within months, it peaks at number 4 on the Billboard charts and stays there for over 2 years. This is the story of how 6 musicians from different worlds, a Mexican guitarist who learned blues in Tijuana bars, a Seattle organist raised on jazz, percussionists from Puerto Rico, Nicaragua, and San Francisco came together to create something America had never heard before. A sound that proved Latin music belonged in rock and roll. A debut album that spent 108 weeks on the charts and changed music forever. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Santana's. Carlos Humberto Santana Barragan was born on July 20, 1947, in Autlán de Navarro, a small town in the Mexican state of Jalisco. His father, José, was a mariachi violinist with a regional reputation. Music wasn't a choice in the Santana household. It was oxygen. By age 5, Carlos was learning violin from his father. By 8, he'd switched to guitar. The young boy absorbed traditional Mexican music like a sponge, but something else was calling to him through the radio waves drifting across the border. The sound of B.B. King, T-Bone Walker, John Lee Hooker, the blues. In 1955, the family moved to Tijuana, right on the California border. For a young Carlos, it was heaven. By day, he'd play for tourists for spare change. By night, he haunted the clubs along the Tijuana Strip, watching local legends like Javier Batis. He became a roadie for the TJs, the city's pioneering rock and roll band. Eventually, at just 12 years old, he joined them as a bass player, because Batis was already on guitar. I read books about how people in their 30s or 40s are just beginning to find out what their purpose in life is, Santana would later recall. I found that out when I was 5 years old. But Tijuana was just the beginning. In 1961, most of the Santana family moved north to San Francisco, settling in the Mission District. Carlos stayed behind, gigging in the clubs, perfecting his craft. When he finally joined his family in 1963, San Francisco was exploding with creativity. The psychedelic revolution was beginning. The Fillmore was becoming rock's most important venue. And a Mexican teenager with a beat-up guitar and dreams bigger than the Mission District was about to change everything. Carlos worked as a dishwasher at the TikTok drive-in, saving money for a Gibson SG after his Melody Maker got destroyed. He attended James Lick Middle School and Mission High School, though music was always his real education. On weekends, he'd sneak into the Fillmore Auditorium, watching the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and the Butterfield Blues Band. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was 1966, a Sunday matinee at Bill Graham's Fillmore Auditorium. Paul Butterfield was scheduled to perform but showed up too intoxicated to play. Graham, the legendary promoter, needed to put together an emergency band. He pulled musicians from the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and the Butterfield Blues Band itself, but he needed another guitarist. Santana's manager Stan Markham suggested Carlos. Graham agreed. During the jam session, something magical happened. Santana's guitar, melodic, soulful, somehow both blues-drenched and otherworldly, caught the attention of everyone in the room. Bill Graham watched this teenager play and saw the future. That same year, Carlos formed the Santana Blues Band with street musicians he'd met around San Francisco. Greg Rowley on Hammond organ and lead vocals, David Brown on bass, Marcus Malone on percussion. They were young, hungry, and starting to develop something no one had quite heard before. The San Francisco music scene in the late 1960s was a laboratory of sound. The Grateful Dead were pioneering psychedelic rock. Jefferson Airplane was pushing boundaries. Sly and the Family Stone was breaking down racial barriers with funk rock fusion. But nobody was doing what Santana was imagining. We didn't know what we were doing, Carlos would later admit. I mean, and thank God we didn't, because it sounds so raw and innocent. What made Santana different was right there in the lineup. Greg Rowley, a white keyboardist from Seattle, brought jazz influences from Jimmy Smith and a love of Hammond organ that gave their sound a psychedelic edge. David Brown, a black bassist from San Francisco, laid down the grooves. And then there were the percussionists. This was revolutionary. Most rock bands had a drummer. Santana had a drummer and two percussionists, congas, timbales, instruments not generally heard in rock music. The polyrhythmic structures of Afro-Cuban music meeting the power of electric blues. Michael Carabello from Puerto Rico brought one set of influences. José Chepito Arias from Nicaragua brought another. When 19-year-old Michael Shreve joined on drums in 1969, literally walking into the studio as the previous drummer was walking out, the classic lineup was complete. I was listening to Jimi Hendrix, Sly and the Family Stone, Gabor Szabo, Willie Bobo, Carabello recalled. Chepito was listening to Los Muñequitos. Carlos was coming from a blues bag of B.B. King, Albert King, and Greg was coming from the Jimmy Smith plane. And Michael Shreve was into Chico Hamilton. So it was a blending of everyone's different styles that made the sound. They called it Latin rock, but it was more than that. It was blues that moved like salsa, rock that breathed with conga rhythms, jazz that hit you in the gut. It was the sound of America's melting pot turned into music. Bill Graham saw the potential immediately. He booked them regularly at the Fillmore West, where they became a fixture. He knew what they needed wasn't just exposure. It was discipline. You don't even know what a song is, Graham told them bluntly. You guys play a bunch of ass jams with no beginning and no end. The band members looked at each other, confused. They'd been thinking of themselves as a jam band, letting their instrumentals stretch for 15-20 minutes. Graham showed them a different path. He played them Willie Bobo's version of Evil Ways, breaking down the structure, intro, verse, chorus. He suggested they cover it. We weren't used to dealing with songs like that, Rowley admitted. But Graham knew something they didn't. To change the world, you first had to reach it, and radio didn't play 15-minute jams. By late 1968, Columbia Records and Atlantic Records were both interested in signing Santana. An audition was organized for both labels, but Carlos had only one choice in mind. I wanted to be on the same label as Miles Davis and Bob Dylan, he said. Columbia it was. By December 1968, the band was signed. In January 1969, Santana entered the studio for their first attempt at recording an album. It didn't go well. The tracks weren't right, the energy wasn't there. They tried again, still not quite clicking. It was their third go at recording an album, according to band biographer Simon Leng. After previous attempts failed to produce results they wanted, personnel changes didn't help. Marcus Malone, the original percussionist, was convicted of manslaughter and began serving time in San Quentin State Prison. Drummer Bob "Doc" Livingston was fired after an argument in the studio. Michael Shreve walked in as Livingston was walking out, and the band invited him to join on the spot. Michael Carabello returned to the fold, bringing with him José Chepito Arias. Suddenly the chemistry clicked. The classic lineup was in place. Carlos Santana on guitar, Greg Rowley on organ and vocals, David Brown on bass, Michael Shreve on drums, Michael Carabello and Chapito Arias on percussion. In May 1969, they tried again at Pacific Recording Studios in San Mateo, California. This time, they had help. Alberto Gianquinto, a pianist who'd played with James Cotton, joined the sessions. He helped with arrangements and quickly identified the band's main problem. The solo spots were too long. Bill Graham agreed. The band needed structure. They needed songs, not just jams. So they worked. They cut the lengthy improvisations. They shaped the material. And Graham pushed them to record Evil Ways. The sessions lasted 1 month, 9 tracks, a mix of structured songs and improvised instrumentals. Raw, electric, alive. I don't think any of us really knew what we were doing, Carabello remembered. We kind of were just adding stuff, and it was like a buffet of learning. The album opened with Waiting, an instrumental that announced their arrival with swirling organ and percussive fire. Evil Ways followed, Clarence Sonny Henry's song, originally recorded by Willie Bobo, but transformed by Santana into something urgent and unforgettable. Greg Rowley's vocals were gritty and confident. Carlos's guitar solo in the double-time coda was pure electricity. Then came Shades of Time, Savor, and Jingo. The latter a cover of Nigerian percussionist Babatunde Olatunji's song, sung partially in Spanish with Carlos absolutely on fire. Side 2 featured Persuasion, Treat, You Just Don't Care, and the album's Closer, the track that would define them forever. Soul Sacrifice. 6 minutes of ritualistic, hypnotic rock and roll. Structured yet improvisational. The 3 percussionists locked in a polyrhythmic conversation. Greg Rowley's Hammond organ blasts. Carlos's guitar singing over it all. And in the middle, Michael Shreve's drum solo, a 19-year-old kid playing like his life depended on it. The album was done. Columbia Records scheduled it for release in late August 1969. But before it could hit stores, Santana's life changed forever. In the summer of 1969, rock festivals dominated the landscape. The Atlantic City Pop Festival in early August drew 100,000 people. Santana played there, impressing some East Coast audiences. But they remained largely unknown nationally. Then came Woodstock. Bill Graham had been asked to help organize the festival. He agreed on one condition. Santana had to be on the bill. The Woodstock promoters, Michael Lang and John Roberts, weren't convinced. Santana hadn't released an album. They were a San Francisco club band. Who would care? But Graham insisted. And his clout, managing Jefferson Airplane and the Grateful Dead, both Woodstock headliners, gave him leverage. Santana was added to the lineup. They'd play on Saturday afternoon, August 16th. Payment, $2,500. The band thought they'd go on late in the evening, close to midnight. They had time to kill. Some of them, including Carlos, decided to take mescaline. It was 1969. Psychedelics were as common as beer. Then came the announcement. You have to go on now or don't go on at all. The schedule had changed. The band was being rushed on stage, and several members were tripping. It threw us off a bit, Carlos admitted, but we were in no position to do anything about it. Michael Carabello remembered the moment vividly. We didn't even have a record out. The Waiting and Evil Ways and all that didn't come out until 3 weeks later. The other thing about that gig is, you might look at the footage and none of us are playing to the crowd. We're all playing to one another. We had no idea that we were going to be the hit of the event. At 2 p.m., Santana took the stage. As Carlos looked out at the audience, his vision warped by the drug coursing through his system, he saw something terrifying and beautiful. It was like standing at the ocean, he recalled. As far as you could see, except for the horizon, was people. They opened with Waiting. Greg Rowley's organ created the framework. Carlos's rhythm guitar followed. Then his solo broke through, melodic and searing. The percussion section, 3 players moving as one organism, drove the whole thing forward with a rhythm white America had rarely heard in rock music. They played You Just Don't Care, Savor, Jingo, Persuasion, Evil Ways, and then they closed with Soul Sacrifice. 11 minutes that became legend. Carlos's guitar crying out over the percussion storm. Michael Shreve's drum solo, captured on film, his long hair flying, his face a mask of concentration, becoming one of Woodstock's most iconic moments. By the time we got to Soul Sacrifice, I had come back from a pretty intense journey, Carlos said. Ultimately, I felt we had plugged into a whole lot of hearts at Woodstock. When they finished, the crowd erupted. 500,000 people who'd never heard of Santana were now believers. The band walked off stage knowing something had shifted. Bill Graham had been right. This was their moment. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, 1969, Columbia Records released Santana. The timing was perfect. Word about Woodstock was spreading. The festival had been chaotic. Traffic nightmares, rain, mud, medical emergencies, but the music had been transcendent, and everyone was talking about the unknown band with the Latin percussion and the Mexican guitarist who played like he was channeling something divine. The album cover, designed by artist Lee Conklin, was psychedelic and mysterious, appropriate for the era. Inside were 9 tracks. Over half of the album's running time was instrumental music. This was not typical top 40 fare. Columbia released Jingo as the first single in October. It was modest, spending 8 weeks on the charts and peaking at number 56, respectable for an unknown band but not a smash. Then, in late December, they released an edited version of Evil Ways. This time, lightning struck. The song had everything Graham had promised. Structure, a hook, Rolly's confident vocals, Carlos's incendiary guitar solo. Radio ate it up. Evil Ways climbed to number 9 on the Billboard Hot 100 in March 1970, spending 13 weeks on the chart. Critics were divided. Some dismissed it. Rolling Stone's Langdon Winner called it a masterpiece of hollow techniques and a speed freak's delight. Fast, pounding, frantic music with no real content. But the people knew better. This music had soul. It had passion. It had something rock had been missing. The rhythms of the world beyond America's borders, brought to the electric stage with power and precision. In October 1969, Bill Graham booked Santana for The Ed Sullivan Show. On national television, dressed in psychedelic clothes and bandanas, they performed Persuasion and Jingo. America watched a new kind of rock and roll being born. The band toured relentlessly. Between August 18, 1969, their first post-Woodstock gig at the Electric Factory in Philadelphia, and June 28, 1970, in England at the Bath Festival, Santana performed at over 70 venues. They were performing somewhere almost daily. They played the Texas International Pop Festival on August 31, 1969, the ill-fated Altamont Free Concert in December 1969, festival after festival, club after club, every night, proving they weren't a fluke, every night, converting new believers. The diverse lineup wasn't just musical, it was cultural, racial, a statement about what America could be. Carlos, born in Mexico, Rolly from Seattle, Carabello from Puerto Rico, Arias from Nicaragua, Brown and Shreve from San Francisco, white, black, brown, all playing as one. The diversity of cultures merging into Santana's songs helped expand the possibilities of rock and turned the genre into a global phenomenon, one critic wrote years later. Santana wasn't just successful, it was revolutionary. The album eventually achieved double platinum certification, selling over 2 million copies in the United States alone. Globally, it introduced millions of listeners to a sound they didn't know they needed. Latin rock had existed before Santana, but it had never been this electric, this powerful, this mainstream. The band proved that congas and timbales belonged on rock stages, that polyrhythmic structures could coexist with blues guitar, that you didn't have to choose between your heritage and your future. For Latino musicians, the impact was profound. Before Santana, there were almost no Latin artists in mainstream American rock. Carlos Santana became a role model, proof that a Mexican kid from Outland could stand on the same stage as white rock gods and not just belong, but transcend. For many white suburban listeners, Santana's were the first rock records they purchased that deviated from blues-derived formats, music historian noted. His work helped build interest in jazz fusion and what would later be known as world music. The album's influence on the Woodstock documentary, released in March 1970, cannot be overstated. The film featured Santana's performance of Soul Sacrifice, and it became one of the movie's most electrifying segments. The film grossed $50 million in the U.S., making it the sixth highest-grossing film of 1970. Millions who hadn't been at Woodstock now saw what the crowd had witnessed. Santana's legend grew. But more than commercial success, the album changed what was possible in rock music. After Santana, rock got more adventurous. More bands incorporated world music influences. The door was open for future fusion experiments, from Weather Report to Mahavishnu Orchestra to countless others. In 2003, Rolling Stone ranked Santana number 150 on their list of the 500 greatest albums of all time. In 2012, it moved up to 149. The album was inducted into the Grammy Hall of Fame in 2012. The singles became standards. Evil Ways is still played on classic rock radio 5 decades later. Soul Sacrifice remains a showcase for what a band can achieve when individual virtuosity serves collective vision. Success came fast, too fast. By 1970, the cracks were already showing. Gregg Rolie and Carlos Santana were starting to want different things. Rolie, along with some other band members, wanted to emphasize the hard rock sound that had helped establish them. It was commercially successful. It made sense. But Carlos was changing. He'd been exposed to Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Pharoah Sanders. He wanted jazz fusion. He wanted spiritual music. He wanted to evolve beyond the blues rock formula. Santana, however, was increasingly interested in moving beyond his love of blues and rock and wanted more jazzy, ethereal elements in the music, one biography noted. The tension built through 1970 and into 1971. Meanwhile, tragedy struck. Jose Chepito Arias suffered a near-fatal brain hemorrhage. The band found temporary replacements, Willie Bobo, then Coke Escovedo. But Michael Carabello felt it was wrong to perform without Arias. Cliques formed, relationships fractured. The band recorded 2 more albums with the classic lineup. Abraxas in 1970, which hit number 1 and became an even bigger success than the debut, and Santana 3 in 1971, also number 1. But the magic was unraveling. In 1972, Santana released Caravanserai, a strong move into jazz fusion. Clive Davis, the Columbia Records executive who'd helped sign them, warned Carlos, "It will sabotage the band's position as a top 40 act." He was right. Caravanserai was critically acclaimed but commercially underwhelming. Gregg Rolie and guitarist Neil Schon left to form Journey. David Brown left due to substance abuse issues. Michael Carabello departed amid lifestyle conflicts. By 1973, Carlos Santana had obtained legal rights to the band name and formed a new version with completely different personnel. The classic lineup was done. The 1970s would be prolific. 14 albums, but commercially uneven. Carlos explored spiritual music under the influence of Guru Sri Chinmoy, even adopting the spiritual name Devadip. He collaborated with John McLaughlin on Love, Devotion, Surrender, and with Alice Coltrane on Illuminations. Jazz fusion fans loved it. Top 40 fans were confused. From 1984 to 1994, sales declined further. No certified albums during that period. Santana continued touring, always touring, racking up nearly 3,000 concerts over 50 years, but they'd fallen from the commercial peak. Then came 1998. The original lineup was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Carlos Santana, Jose Chepito Arias, David Brown, who would die in 2000, Michael Carabello, Greg Rowley, and Michael Shreve, together again, acknowledging what they'd built. A year later, Clive Davis, now at Arista Records, convinced Carlos to make a comeback album with contemporary artists. Supernatural was released in 1999, featuring collaborations with Rob Thomas, Lauryn Hill, Eric Clapton, and others. It became the biggest success of Santana's career. 30 million copies sold worldwide, 8 Grammy Awards in one night, tying Michael Jackson's record. The guitar player from Outland had proven he could transcend time itself. Santana, the 1969 debut album, achieved what few albums do. It created a genre. It changed an industry. And 56 years later, it still sounds fresh. The album has sold over 16 million equivalent units worldwide. It spent more than 2 years on the charts when most albums disappear in weeks. It launched a career that has sold over 100 million records globally. But numbers don't capture the real legacy. The real legacy is in every Latin rock band that followed, in every fusion experiment, in every musician who believed they could bring their culture to the mainstream without compromising their identity. Carlos Santana became one of the most respected guitarists in history. Rolling Stone magazine ranked him number 11 on their 2023 list of the greatest guitarists of all time. His guitar tone, that singing, sustaining, melodic cry, became instantly recognizable. Guitarists still study his phrasing, his note choice, his ability to make one note say more than others could say with 100. The album's influence extends beyond music. It was a cultural statement in 1969 when America was deeply divided over race, war, and identity. Here was a band, Latino, white, black, from multiple countries, making music together, proving diversity wasn't just tolerable but transcendent. The classic lineup reunited in 2013, announcing plans to record together again. In 2016, they released Santana I-4, a return to their roots. Michael Shreve, Michael Carabello, Greg Rowley, and Carlos Santana back in the studio together. Neil Schon joined them. The chemistry was still there. The Woodstock performance remains iconic. Whenever discussions of the greatest festival performances occur, Soul Sacrifice is mentioned. Watching the Woodstock documentary, seeing Michael Shreve's drum solo, seeing Carlos lost in his guitar, seeing 500,000 people connected to something primal and new, it's still electrifying. Songs from the album have become immortal. Evil Ways is covered by countless artists. Soul Sacrifice is studied in music schools. Jingo introduced American audiences to Babatunde Olatunji's genius. And the album itself? It stands as proof that great art comes from collision. When different cultures collide, when jazz meets blues meets Latin rhythms meets rock power, when 6 strangers from different worlds decide to make music together, magic happens. The story of Santana's 1969 debut is the story of America at its best. Not the America of walls and borders and divisions, but the America of possibility. The America where a Mexican immigrant with a guitar and a dream could stand on the biggest stage in the country and prove that his culture, his rhythm, his vision belonged. Carlos Santana was 22 years old when that album was released, a former dishwasher who'd worked the clubs of Tijuana and the streets of San Francisco. He'd been told that Latin-infused rock wouldn't work. that Americans wouldn't buy it, that he should stick to what was safe. But Bill Graham believed, and Columbia Records took a chance. And on a muddy farm in upstate New York, in front of 500,000 people, Santana proved everyone wrong. The album wasn't perfect. Contemporary critics complained about too much improvisation, not enough songs. The band members themselves admitted they didn't know what they were doing. But that rawness, that innocence, that willingness to experiment, that was the beauty. They weren't trying to make a Latin rock masterpiece. They were just trying to make music that felt true. And in that truth, they accidentally created something eternal. 6 musicians, 9 tracks, 45 minutes of music. And 56 years later, when you put Waiting On and hear that organ swell, when Soul Sacrifice kicks in and those congas start talking, when Carlos's guitar begins to sing, it still sounds like the future. That's the power of great art. It doesn't age. It doesn't fade. It just keeps revealing new layers, new meanings, new reasons to believe that music can change the world. Santana proved that rock and roll wasn't just for one culture, one race, one sound. It was for everyone. And when everyone brings what they have to the table, their blues, their jazz, their Latin rhythms, their life experience, the result isn't dilution, it's revolution. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And some stories, like Santana's, prove that the best music happens when borders disappear and 6 strangers become one voice.